So to adjust joystick sensitivity in B-17, we'll need to use an external third-party program, and in this case we'll use one called Joystick Curves. Now this is available from this website, and I'll put a link to this in the video description below. So go to this website, and there are two components that need to be downloaded. The first is a virtual joystick driver, and the second is the application itself. Now, this website suggests the use of either one of two available virtual joystick drivers, the first by Headsoft and the second by Shaul Isakovich. Now, I recommend using the second of these two that are offered, and the reason being that the Shaul Isakovich driver is still undergoing development, and it has support forums and is being actively supported at this time. Whereas the Headsoft driver doesn't appear to be currently under any further development, and the website shows no further updates since 2014. I also prefer the configuration options, which seem to be a larger variety and flexibility that Shaul Isakovich has provided within his virtual joystick driver. So what we'll do is we'll download these two components, and I'll show you how they are installed and set up. So first of all, we'll download the virtual joystick driver, and this is what's presented here, and you just click on this download icon. So that's the virtual joystick driver downloaded, and now we'll go back to the main Joystick Curves website and we'll download the main application, again to the same location. Okay, so now we have both programs downloaded. Now it's important to set up the virtual joystick first, so we'll double click on the virtual joystick setup program and get that kicked off. Now at the user account control dialog box, just click yes. And then the next step, click next. Now, when you have the components presented to you for selection, you don't need the demo Joy feeder application, as only if you're going to be working on kind of developing programs that access this virtual joystick driver yourself. But I do recommend that you keep the configuration application and monitoring application checked and have those installed. And I'll show those two programs in a short while on this video. So there we go, that's the virtual joystick driver set up. Now we'll set up the Joystick Curves program. Double click on the setup program there, and we'll run the setup. And there we go, that's the Joystick Curves program running. So go ahead and minimize Joystick Curves for now. We'll have a look at the configuration settings for the virtual joystick. So we'll first of all search for vJoy, and you can see the two applications that we installed during the installation process, the configure vJoy and monitor vJoy. So we'll just start these one by one, and that's the user account control dialog box, which we'll just say yes at. And we'll also start the monitor application. So again, we'll just search for vJoy, monitor application. So looking at the configuration program, we can see tabs at the top here, each of which represents an individual virtual joystick device. And so you can see there is a potential to have up to 16 virtual joysticks. And virtual joysticks can be added by clicking on an unused tab and then clicking Add Device. And that allows an additional device to be configured. For the purposes of B-17, we only need one joystick, so I will just configure the vJoy device number 1. So here we can see all of the defaults that are set for this, and our virtual joystick has these features by default. So all of the items here that are checked, so all the various axes and sliders. You can also configure a number of buttons. Now you can have any value there between 0 and 128, so it's very flexible, as I mentioned earlier. You can also configure up to 4 point of view hat switches. Now these can either be continuous, which I believe is effectively like an analog point of view switch, or 4 directions, which I believe would be like a non-analog or digital point of view switch. So we actually don't need to make any changes here, because this encompasses all of the features that we will need when running B-17, and in fact includes many that we won't actually use. But having them set at these default values is harmless, so we'll just leave them set as is. If you did want to see if your virtual joystick device is working correctly, once you have it configured in this program and you have something that is utilizing and outputting to the virtual joystick, such as Joystick Curves, then you can monitor the output through this application, and you'll be able to see the various highlights as buttons are pressed and the various movements as the joystick is moved around. I won't be covering that any further at this time. So let's go back to Joystick Curves. So now we're going to set up Joystick Curves so that we can adjust joystick sensitivity. However, first of all, you need to plug in your joystick and make sure that it's been correctly detected by Windows. And we can verify that within Joystick Curves by monitoring this green graphic in the right hand portion of the dialog box. So go ahead and fire up Joystick Curves and then move your joystick around, and what you should see is a dark green cross moving around in accordance with your position of your joystick. So that's pitch and roll. What we can also test is yaw, which is represented in this bottom portion of the dialog. And I can twist my HOTAS to the left and to the right, and what you should see is a dark green line moving in accordance with the joystick movements. Now what you may have noticed is that there is also a bright green cross and a bright green line here, and that when you move your joystick around, that they don't move. And that's because the dark green cross and line represent the input to Joystick Curves from your physical joystick, whereas the bright green cross and the bright green line represent the output from Joystick Curves via the virtual joystick. So you'll see that the virtual joystick is showing no movement at all, and that's also replicated here in the virtual joystick monitor, and no matter how much I move my joystick around, the virtual joystick monitor shows no change in any of its axes whatsoever. And the reason for that is because we haven't yet linked the physical joystick to the virtual joystick within Joystick Curves, and so we'll do that right now. Now this is achieved on an axis by axis basis, and that's represented by a tab representing each individual axis. So we'll first of all start off here on the first tab, and we'll choose our physical joystick, which in my case is the T-Flight HOTAS X, and we want to link that to the virtual joystick. This is from the virtual joystick driver that we installed earlier, and it's called a vJoy device. So we'll start off with choosing the first axis that we want to adjust sensitivity on, and in my case that will be roll. And I want to map the roll from the physical joystick to the virtual joystick. Now, having completed that mapping, all that simply does is it means that when we move our joystick along the roll axis, the virtual joystick now moves in direct accordance with the physical joystick. So you'll note here that no matter how far along the roll axis I move the joystick, the virtual joystick moves in exact unison with the physical joystick, i.e. both the dark green cross and the light green cross always have the same position along that roll axis. And you'll see the same movement here in the virtual joystick monitor. So what we need to do is to adjust the sensitivity of the virtual joystick relative to the physical joystick, And that's achieved via this response curve multiplier section here. Now this chart is a chart that shows on the y-axis a multiplier which varies between 0 down at the bottom left corner here up to 1 at the top left, and along the x-axis here it's a representation from the joystick being centered over on this left hand side to the joystick being at the extreme of one of the axes on the right hand side. So if we put that into practice with this line that's shown, what that means is that no matter the position of the joystick as you move it from a joystick centered position to a joystick at the extreme of an axis position, the multiplier is always 1. Hence the reason why with this current setup there's no variation in joystick sensitivity. You see no difference in the movement along the roll axis between the dark green and the bright green crosses. So what we need to do is to make an adjustment to that sensitivity. Now this is a bit of a trial and error process in terms of setting up a response curve and then playing the game and seeing if that works for you, and trying to figure out what changes you may need to make to that sensitivity to make it better for you. And so you'll need to play the game, come back to Joystick Curves, make some adjustments, save those changes, and then go and play the game again. So what I found for my T-Flight HOTUS X was that a fairly simple linear curve worked great for me. And I'll show you that in a moment. But what I will show you is how you make the adjustments to the response curve, how you reset it, and then I'll show you my particular curve that I use. So you can make some fairly fancy curves in here. You've got great flexibility. You make the changes, first of all, on a course basis by adjusting these red blocks to positions along the axis that you're adjusting. And then you can use the grey blocks to adjust the shape of those curves. Okay, so you can create some quite weird and wonderful shapes in here. So when I move the joystick over here, you'll see if I move the joystick to the midway position, you'll see that the virtual joystick is now representing a much lower output relative to the physical joystick, and that corresponds to the position along this curve. So you'll see it doing the virtual joystick position doing some fairly jerky movements as it leaps through these sudden changes. Now that's not very useful in game. So what I normally do is just have a nice simple linear relationship between the extreme points. So first of all, to get there, I'll just reset this curve back to the default, and that's achieved by right-clicking in this graph area and then selecting Reset Curve. What I then do is I then move my left-hand red block down to about the quarter point, the 25% mark, and I then right-click and select Straighten Curve. Although it's spelt incorrectly, it does actually work correctly. So straightening the curve now straightens the curve between the two extreme points that have been set up by the red blocks at those extremes. So I've now got a linear relationship between when the joystick is centered and when the joystick is at its extreme. And so when I start to move my joystick, you'll see the largest difference between the virtual joystick output and the physical joystick output is when we have only small movements in the joystick down at this end from the centered position. And as we get closer and closer to the extreme, you'll notice as the multiplier gradually ramps back up towards 1, the virtual joystick position gets closer and closer to the physical joystick position. So I keep moving the joystick up a little bit there by accident. So I'll just show you that again. You'll also note that the position is replicated in the virtual joystick monitor here in exactly the same way as the position of this green cross changes. So now I've set up the sensitivity profile that I want for the roll axis. I need to set the same thing up for pitch and yaw. And to do that, you need to add an additional tab, one for each axis. So it's an axis tab I'm setting up. we'll go through setting up the physical devices as before, and this time we'll select pitch for the axis, again matching to pitch on the virtual joystick. Now if we go back to roll, so this is the sensitivity curve we want to copy across to pitch, I can now right click in this roll tab and then copy curve to pitch. So if I now go to the pitch tab, you'll see that the response curve is exactly the same as I had set up for roll. So now we'll add the final tab, an axis, which is yaw. Another axis tab. We'll select our devices, and this time we'll select yaw. And we'll go back to any of the prior two tabs to copy the curve from them to copy it to yaw. So now we've got roll, pitch, and yaw. Now one thing you want to do is, you may notice that when I go from roll, if you look at this preserve axis range piece here, to pitch, you actually want to uncheck that. Now I don't fully understand what preserve axis range does. In the words of the developer, it enables interpolating in the current position to compensate for that part missing of the axis. And he also states that this will lose preciseness but not movement range. So I don't actually quite understand what that does, but I do know that I normally leave that turned off, and I've seen others recommend that that be turned off. And certainly everything works fine for me with it off. What you don't want to have is certainly any difference between the three different axes in terms of that setting. So having set up the three different axes, we'll just do a quick test to make sure that they are all being replicated here on the green chart. And so let's just do some movement to make sure that the virtual joystick is tracking at a lower sensitivity to the physical joystick. So that's pitch and roll, and that seems to be fine in that the dark green cross is always further out than the bright green cross. And I'll just do a similar test on yaw. Again, the dark green line is further than the light green line. And that's all working perfectly. So now that we have our sensitivity settings set up for B-17, it's appropriate that we should name this profile accordingly. So I'm going to rename this profile as B-17 and then just tab out of there. And then I want to save these settings so that each time we run the program, these settings will come back up. And by default, under the settings options for the entire program, you are prompted on exit to save your settings. So what we'll do is we'll close the program. It's prompted me to save my settings, so I'll say yes. And then we'll kick the program back off again. And as you can see, it has reloaded the settings. Now this means that every time you want to play B-17, you will need to first of all plug in your joystick, then fire up Joystick Curves before you start the B-17 game. That's the only way to ensure that B-17 will work correctly with Joystick Curves. So having now set up roll, pitch and yaw in Joystick Curves, we obviously want B-17 to use the output from Joystick Curves as the input to those axes in the game control settings. Unfortunately, if you go into B-17 and try and set those axes up and have the program scan for your joystick, the only way you can move the joystick is to move your physical joystick, and therefore it is your physical joystick that B-17 detects and not the output from Joystick Curves. So Joystick Curves has a neat feature to overcome this, and it's called this virtual axis test loop. Now, just starting off in this roll tab here, if we turn this on, what we can see is that this has the effect of forcing an output from the virtual joystick along the axis tab that we have selected here. So that means that we can now move over to the B-17 game and have the game scan for a joystick output, and it will see now this virtual joystick output from Joystick Curves. So we'll just move over to B-17 and do that right now. So first of all, starting off at the B-17 title screen, we'll go on to the options panel, and continue, and then into the controls menu and forward. So we have the virtual axis test loop turned on in Joystick Curves for roll. We need to first of all click on roll in the B-17 list here. And now, as you can see, it is currently set to controller number 1, which in my case is my physical joystick. To get it to respond to the virtual joystick, I now need to click on this line and tell B-17 to start scanning for the output from Joystick Curves. And so I'll do that right now. Now this can take a few moments, so you just need to be patient and wait. So there we can see the output from the virtual joystick being detected along here. And the line here now shows it's coming from controller number 2. Remember, controller number 1 was my physical joystick, and in my case, controller number 2 is the virtual joystick. So with that one set, we can now Alt-Tab back to the Windows desktop and go back to Joystick Curves again. So having finished setting up roll in B-17, we can now move on to pitch. So going back to Joystick Curves, first of all, we need to turn off the virtual axis test loop for roll, then go to the pitch tab, and then turn on the virtual axis test loop for pitch. And we can now see that the virtual joystick pitch axis is scrolling an output from Joystick Curves. So again, we'll move over to the B-17 game and set up pitch. So here we are back in B-17. We have the virtual test loop for pitch currently active. So we'll click on pitch in the B-17 control list, and we will click on the axis line here to get that scanning for the virtual joystick output. Again, be patient. It does take a few moments to detect it correctly. So we can see now that this is picking up again controller number 2, which as we determined from the first setting on roll, that controller number 2 is the output from the virtual joystick driver. So that's great. So now we will Alt-Tab again back to the desktop and to Joystick Curves to set the final axis yaw. So having set up the pitch axis in B-17, we can now move over to yaw from Joystick Curves. So first of all, on the pitch tab, we'll turn off the pitch virtual axis test loop. We'll click on the yaw tab, and then we'll click the virtual axis test loop output from there. And now we can see that the yaw output from the virtual joystick is scrolling along. So again, we'll move over to B-17 and set that one up. So here we are back in B-17 again to set the final axis using the output from the virtual joystick driver, and that is yaw. So we'll click on the yaw axis in the control list, and then we'll click on the axis line here again to tell B-17 to scan for the output from Joystick Curves and that yaw virtual test loop. And again, that has now correctly detected controller number 2, i.e. the virtual test loop output. And we can see that in the movement of this gauge again here. So that's it. That is B-17 set up now with the appropriate sensitivities adjusted for the various axes here, pitch, roll and yaw. And what you must do is don't forget to click on this switch here to save those changes. So having set up all 3 axes now, we have completed the setup. We should first of all turn off the virtual axis test loop switch for yaw. And if you just move your physical joystick a moment, you'll see that they all recenters here. We'll just move the yaw, flick that momentarily, and that's all centered. And so we have completed the setup of the virtual joystick in B-17 such that it will now respond along this sensitivity curve for each axis. We'll just add that if after testing this curve or a curve of your choosing in B-17 and it's not working quite right for you, then all you simply need to do is come back to Joystick Curves, make the adjustments to the response curve here, and then go back into B-17. There's no need to re-scan for the output from the virtual joystick or anything. That is already set up. So you can just freely iterate around by adjusting your response curve, jumping into B-17, playing the game, and coming back to Joystick Curves and doing further adjustments as necessary. An issue that I have identified with Joystick Curves relates to its default behavior that upon shutting down, it prompts you with this dialog box to save settings where you respond either yes, no, or cancel. Now, what happens here is that if Joystick Curves is running either visibly or in the background, and when it is in the background, its icon is shown in the icon tray down here, that when you try and shut down your PC, Joystick Curves will actually throw up that dialog box prompting for a user input to say yes or no to saving Joystick Curve settings. Now, you may or may not be at your computer when that dialog box pops up, and oftentimes I'll tell my computer to shut down, I'll turn my computer monitor off, and I'll walk away. Oftentimes what has happened is that Joystick Curves has been running in the background, that dialog box has popped up after some time during the shutdown process, and then the shutdown process halts at that point. And what this means is that your computer will not shut down. And oftentimes I've come back after several hours to restart my computer only to find it actually didn't shut down in the first place, and that the Joystick Curves Save Settings dialog box is still up on screen. So there is a way around this. First of all, we'll just start up Joystick Curves again. And if we go into the settings of the program, there is a setting here that says ask to save settings on exit, and a simple solution is just to turn that off, and then when we close the program it no longer prompts to save settings. And if we go back into the program, we can verify that setting is still unchecked. Now that's all well and good, and that may be fine for you. The downside is that the save settings on exit is still checked. And that means every single time you close Joystick Curves or you shut down the machine, and when Joystick Curves is active, the settings of Joystick Curves will always be saved. So that means if you've been doing some experimentation with either the response curves or any of the other settings, and you close the program down, it will actually save those settings. Now, if you don't want those settings saved, a simple solution again is just to uncheck that box and close the program, in which case any experimentation you've been doing at that time will not be saved. So if we now go back into Joystick Curves and just double check the settings, this is the issue. Now, Joystick Curves does not remember the setting that you have selected here when you do it via this dialog box. So if you have a desire to turn this off permanently, I will show you how to do that right now. So the first thing you need to do is to close Joystick Curves. And then we need to navigate to this folder, which is a data folder for Joystick Curves. And I'll put this into the video description below so that you can copy it in the same way I'm about to now, which I'm just going to do a Control-C there for copy. I'll open up File Explorer, and then you paste that folder path there and hit Enter. And this takes you to the data path for Joystick Curves. And then in search, so we're going to type user.config. Now the search should find at least one user.config file. If multiple files do come up, you want to identify the one that has the latest date and time. What we're now going to do is we're going to open this in Notepad. So I'm just going to right click and then do Open with Notepad and then do OK. And then we're going to just maximize or enlarge that window a bit so you can see more of it. And then what you should see is, having turned off the ask to save settings on exit, you should see this setting in the user config file. And what you want to do is you need to select all 3 lines around that parameter. You want to make sure that it encompasses the setting piece at the beginning for global ask save, and also the /setting line at the end. And again, we're going to do Control-C to copy, and then go to the beginning of the global ask save line, and then do Control V to paste. Now I'm going to hit enter here also so that it forces the global rsave line back to its own line. So having now done that, what we need to do is to modify this parameter on the first global ask save and change that to save on exit, and ensure that you capitalize the S, O and E, and then you want to set the value to false, and then we're going to save that file and we can close it. We can close File Explorer now. And now if we start Joystick Curves and we go to settings, you can see that the save settings on exit option is now unchecked. Now it is important to just bear in mind that if you do via this dialog box turn save settings on exit back on, the only way to ensure that it is locked back off again is to edit that user.config file. Now there is a well-known issue with vJoy, and I believe most if not all other virtual joystick drivers, in that they can affect the camera when you're playing 3D games that use the mouse to operate the camera view. And now what I'm showing on screen here now is what happens is you end up with the camera being completely out of control and spinning round and round and round. Now, to prevent this, what you need to do is before you run the 3D game is to actually disable your virtual joystick driver. And with vJoy, there are two ways of doing this, and I'll illustrate both of these right now. So the first is to either do it via the device manager, and in device manager, vJoy is located under the human interface devices, and it's the vJoy device. And we can disable this by either right-clicking on the vJoy device itself and clicking disable, or by ensuring the vJoy device is highlighted and then clicking on the disable button at the top here. And I'll just do that as an example now. And you should hear the audible chime to indicate that the device has now been disabled. And obviously you can re-enable it from here as well by either right-clicking on the vJoy device to enable it, or by clicking on the enable button in the toolbar at the top. So that's the first method of enabling and disabling the vJoy driver. The second is via the vJoy configuration program. So if I just do search for vJoy, open up the configuration program, and we're just getting the user account dialog box being shown here, which I've just clicked yes at. And within the configuration program for vJoy, there is a checkbox in the bottom left where you can disable and enable vJoy. So we'll just do that right now. So I'm going to uncheck it. Again, you could hear the chime to show it's been unchecked. All of the options within this tab have all become grayed out. And also we can see in Device Manager, the vJoy device now is disabled. What I would recommend you do is, if you're going to do it by the Device Manager, you always do it via Device Manager. If you're going to do it via vJoy, you always do it via vJoy. Because if I was to re-enable vJoy in Device Manager, what you'll note is that yes, it has become enabled in here. These options have become black again instead of grayed out, but this checkbox has not updated itself. But if I were to recheck this, then this just allows it to catch up with itself in that it's now in accordance with the Device Manager, and it will work again for disabling. But it's probably just safer to exclusively use either the vJoy configuration program for enabling and disabling it, or the Device Manager. So once you've disabled vJoy, and let's go back to Dragon's Lair 3D again and see what happens now. Perfect. So that's working great. So anyway, that's the way to get your camera issues resolved if you're using a virtual joystick driver. Okay folks, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching again. I hope these tutorials are useful. I've got a whole bunch more to do for B-17, so stay tuned. please like, subscribe, and please leave your feedback in the comments section below. Anyway, thanks very much, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.